course, a collision course. The political parties are about to split and over this issue. And this is so important. It's like one of the important things that Lincoln's address is ranks right up there with things like this day will live in infamy. Romanism and rebellion, which is an election changer. But this is even more than all of those things. The nation is about to be involved in the final struggle for the nature of the Union, and legitimacy and morality of slavery are not. We're the last major nation in Western history to not have abolished slavery. It was indeed a peculiar situation to have the peculiar institution in America. And we hope that you will gain some insight into what the issues were. And these two gentlemen will portray those two characters, and I think it'll be informative, and I think that you will enjoy it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I appear before you today for the purpose of discussing the leading political topics which now agitate the public mind. This vast concourse of people shows the deep feelings which pervades the masses in regard to this question. By an arrangement previously made, we have today a joint discussion between Mr. Lincoln and myself as the representatives of the two great political parties in this state and union. Prior to 1854, this country was divided into two great political parties, known as the Whig and Democratic parties, both national and patriotic in their principles, both advocating principles which were universal in their application. An old-line Whig could proclaim his principles in Louisiana and in Massachusetts alike. Whig principles were not limited by the Ohio River, nor by the Potomac, nor by the line of free and slave states, but applied wherever proclaimed, wherever the Constitution ruled, or the American flag waved over American soil. The Whig Party and the Democratic Party jointly adopted the compromise measures of 1850 as the basis of the solution of the slavery question in all its forms. Clay was the great leader, with Daniel Webster on his right and Lewis Cass on his left, sustained by the patriots in the Whig and Democratic ranks in devising and adopting and enacting the compromise measures of 1850. Again, in 1851, in Illinois, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party united in resolutions endorsing and improving the compromise measures of 1850 as the proper adjustment of this question. In 1852, when the Whig Party assembled at Baltimore for the purpose of nominating its candidate for the presidency, the first thing it did was to adopt the compromise measures of 1850 in substance and in principle as the satisfactory adjustment of that question. I desire to address myself to your judgment, to your understanding, to your consciences, and not to your passions. I was saying when the Democratic Convention assembled at Baltimore in 1852 for the purpose of nominating a candidate to the presidency, they also adopted the compromise measures of 1850 as the basis of democratic action. Thus, you see that up to 1853, 1854, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party both stood on the same platform in regard to the slavery question, which now agitates the country. That platform was the right of the people of each state and of each territory to decide their local and domestic institutions for themselves, subject only to the federal Constitution. At the session of 1853-1854, I introduced into the Senate of the United States a bill to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska on that principle, which had been adopted in the compromise measures of 1850, approved by the Whig and Democratic Party and the Democratic Party in Illinois in 1851, and endorsed by the Whig Party and the Democratic Party in the National Conventions of 1852. In order that there might be no misunderstanding in regard to the principle involved in the Kansas and Nebraska bill, I put forth the true intent and meaning of the act in these words. It being the true intent and meaning of this act not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, not to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the federal Constitution. Thus you see that up to 1854, when the Kansas and Nebraska bill was brought into Congress for the purpose of carrying out the principles which up to that time both parties had endorsed and approved, there had been no division in this country in regard to that principle, except the opposition of the abolitionists. In the Illinois legislature, in the House of Representatives, upon the resolution asserting that principle, every Whig and every Democrat in the House voted for that principle. Only 4 men voted against it, and those 4 men were old line abolitionists. In 1854, Mr. Abraham Lincoln and Mr. Lyman Trumbull, our U.S. Senator and supporter of Mr. Lincoln, entered into an arrangement, one with the other, and each with their respective friends, to dissolve the old Whig Party on the one hand, and to dissolve the old Democratic Party on the other hand, and convert the members of both parties into an abolitionist party under the name Republican Party. The terms of that arrangement between Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Trumbull have been published to the world by Mr. Lincoln's special friend, Mr. James H. Matheny, which was that Mr. Lincoln was to have General James Shields' place, then about to become vacant in the United States Senate, and Mr. Trumbull was to have my place. Mr. Lincoln went to work industriously to abolitionize the old Whig Party all over the state, pretending that he was as good a Whig as he ever was. Trumbull went to work in his part of the state, down in Egypt, what we refer to as Southern Illinois, preaching abolitionism in a milder and lighter form, but yet trying to abolitionize the Democratic Party and bring the old Democrats handcuffed, bound hand and foot into the abolition camp. I desire to know whether Mr. Lincoln today stands pledged as he did in 1854 in favor of the unconditional repeal of the Fugitive Slave Law. I desire him to answer whether he stands pledged today, as he did in 1854, against the admission of any more slave states, even if the people want them. I want to know if he stands pledged to vote against the admission of a new state into the Union, with such a constitution as the people of that state may see to make fit. I desire to know whether he stands pledged today to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. I desire to know whether he stands pledged to abolish and prohibit the slave trade between the states. I desire to know whether he stands pledged to prohibit slavery in all the territories of the United States, north as well as south of the Missouri Compromise line. I desire him to answer whether he is opposed to the acquisition of any more territory unless slavery is first prohibited therein. I want Abraham Lincoln to answer these questions. in order that when I trot him down into Lower Egypt, I may compel him to repeat the same. My principles are the same everywhere. I can proclaim them alike in the north, and in the south, and in the east, and in the west. My principles will apply everywhere where the Constitution prevails and the American flag flies over American soil. I desire to know whether Mr. Lincoln's principles will bear to be transplanted from Ottawa to Jonesboro. I put these questions to you today, and I ask an answer. I have a right to an answer, for I quote them from the platform of the Republican Party. The platform made by himself and others at the time the Republican Party was first formed. And the bargain was made to dissolve and kill off and destroy the old Whig and Democratic parties and transfer each of their members, bound hand and foot, into the Abolition Party. In the remarks I have made upon this platform and the positions of Mr. Lincoln upon it, I mean nothing personal, disrespectful, or unkind to that gentleman. I have known him nearly for 25 years. We have had many points of sympathy when I first got acquainted with him. We were both comparatively boys, struggling with poverty in a strange land for our support. I am a humble school teacher from the town of Winchester. He, a flourishing grocery keeper in the town of Salem. He was more successful in his occupation than I, and thus became more fortunate in this world's goods. Mr. Lincoln is one of those peculiar men that has performed with admirable skill in every occupation that he ever attempted. I made as good a school teacher as I could, and when a cabinet maker, I made the best bedsteads and tables, but my old bones said I was better in bureaus and secretaries than anything else. But I believe Mr. Lincoln was more successful in his business than I, for his business soon carried him directly into the legislature. There I met him in a little time, and I had sympathy for him. I did, because of the uphill struggle that we had in life. He was then as good as telling an anecdote as now. He could beat any of the boys at wrestling. He could outrun them at a foot race, beat them at pitching quoits or tossing a copper, and could win more liquor than all of the boys put together. And the dignity and impartiality with which he presided over a horse race or a fist fight were the praise of everybody that was present and participated. Hence, I had sympathy for him, because he was struggling with misfortune, and so was I. Mr. Lincoln served with me, or I with him, in the legislature of 1836 when we parted. He subsided or submerged for some years, and I lost sight of him. In 1846, when David Wilmot, the senator from Pennsylvania, raised that Wilmot Proviso tornado, Mr. Lincoln again turned up as a member of Congress from the Sangamon district. I, being in the Senate of the United States, was called to welcome him, then without friend or companion. He then distinguished himself by his opposition to the Mexican War, taking the side of the enemy in time of war against his own country. When he returned home from that Congress, he found that the indignation of the people followed him everywhere until he again retired to public life and was submerged until he was again forgotten by his friends. He came up again in 1854 just in time to make the abolition Republican platform in company with Lovejoy, Giddings, Chase, and Fred Douglass for the Republican Party to stand on. Hence, having formed this new party for the joint benefit of deserters from Whiggery and deserters from democracy, having laid down the abolition platform which I have read, Mr. Lincoln now takes the stand and proclaims his abolition doctrine. Let me read part of it. In his speech to the convention, which nominated him for the Senate in Springfield, he says, in my opinion, the slavery agitation will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect that it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest, in the belief that in its course of the ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push forward until it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. I have no doubt that that doctrine expresses your sentiments, and yet I will prove to you, if you will listen to me, that doctrine is revolutionary and destructive of the existence of our government. Mr. Lincoln here says that our government cannot endure permanently in the same condition in which it was made by its framers. It was made divided into free and slave states. Mr. Lincoln has said it existed for nearly 80 years, thus divided. But he tells you that it cannot endure permanently on the same principles and in the same condition relatively in which your fathers made it. Why can't it endure divided into free and slave states? Washington, as the president of the convention, Franklin and Madison and Hamilton and Jay and the patriots of the day made this government divided into free and slave states, leaving each state perfectly free to do as it pleased on that subject of slavery. Why can't it exist upon the same principles upon which our fathers made it? They knew that the laws and regulations that would suit the granite hills of New Hampshire would be unsuited to the rice plantations of South Carolina. Hence, they provided that each state should retain its own legislature with its own sovereignty, with the full and complete power to do as it pleased within its own limits in all that was local and not national. One of the reserved rights of the states was that of regulating the relation between master and slave, or the slavery question. At that time, that is when the Constitution was made, there were 13 states in the Union, 12 of which were slave states, and 1 was free. Suppose this doctrine of uniformity, all to be one or all to be the other, now preached by Mr. Lincoln, had prevailed then. What would have been the result? Of course, the 12 slaveholding states would have overruled the one free state, and slavery would have been fastened by a constitutional provision on every inch of the American continent, instead of being left as our fathers wisely left it, for each state to decide for themselves. Now, my friends, if we will only act rigidly and conscientiously upon the great principle of popular sovereignty, which guarantees to each state and each territory the right to do as it pleases, instead of Congress interfering, we will be at peace with one another. Why should Illinois be at war with Missouri? or Kentucky with Ohio, or Virginia with New York, merely because their institutions differ. Our fathers intended that these institutions should differ. Our fathers knew that the South and the North, so far apart, differing in climate and production, had different interests, requiring different institutions. The doctrine of uniformity, Mr. Lincoln making all of them conform alike, is a new doctrine, never dreamed of by Washington or Madison or the framers of the Constitution. Mr. Lincoln and the Republican Party set themselves up as wiser than those who made the government. If we still only obey the principle of popular sovereignty, we can go forward increasing in territory, increasing in power, increasing in strength and glory until the Republic of America shall be the North Star that guides the friends of freedom throughout the civilized world. Then, my friends, why can we not adhere to that great principle of self-government upon which our institutions were originally made? I believe that this new doctrine preached by Mr. Lincoln and the Abolitionist Party would dissolve the Union. They tried to array the northern states in one body against the South, in fighting a sectional war of the free states against the slave states, to the last, until one or the other shall be driven to the wall. I am told my time is out. You will now hear from Mr. Lincoln. For an hour and a half.
My fellow citizens, when a man hears himself somewhat misrepresented, it provokes him. At least I find it so with myself. It is more apt to amuse him. The first thing I see fit to notice is the fact that Judge Douglas alleges, after running through the history of the old Democratic and old Whig parties, that Judge Trumbull and myself made an arrangement in 1854 by which I was to have the place of General Shields in the United States Senate, and Judge Trumbull was to have the place of Judge Douglas. Now, all I have to say upon that subject is I think no man, not even Judge Douglas, can prove it, because it is not true. I have no doubt he is conscientious in saying it. As to the resolutions that he took such a length of time to read as being the platform of the Republican Party in 1854, I say I never had anything to do with them, and I think Trumbull never had. Judge Douglas cannot show that either one of us ever did have anything to do with them. I believe this is true about those resolutions. There was a call for a convention to form a Republican Party in Springfield, and I think that my friend Mr. Lovejoy, who was here upon this stand, had a hand in it. I think this is true, and I think if he will remember accurately, he will be able to recollect that he tried to get me into it, and I would not go in. I believe it is also true that I went away from Springfield when the convention was in session to attend court in Tazewell County. It is true they did place my name, though without my authority, upon the committee, and afterwards wrote me to attend the meeting of the committee. But I refused to do so, and I never had anything to do with that organization. This is the plain truth of the matter of the resolutions. Now, about this story that Judge Douglas tells of Trumbull bargaining to sell out the old Democratic Party and Lincoln agreeing to sell out the old Whig Party, I have the means of knowing about that. Judge Douglas cannot. And I know there is no substance to it whatever. Yet I have no doubt he is conscientious about it. I know that after Mr. Lovejoy got into the legislature that winter, he complained of me that I told all the old Whigs in his district that the old Whig Party was good enough for them. And some of them voted against him because I told them so. Now I have no means of totally disproving such charges as this which the judge makes. A man cannot prove a negative, but he has the right to claim that when a man makes an affirmative charge, he must offer some proof to show the truth of what he says. I certainly cannot introduce testimony to show the negative about things, but I have a right to claim that if a man says he knows a thing, then he must show he knows it. I always have a right to claim this, and it is not satisfactory to me that he may be conscientious on that subject. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to waste my time on such things, but in regard to that general abolition tilt that Judge Douglas makes, when he says that I was engaged at the time in selling out and abolitionizing the old Whig Party, I think we shall try to show that it is wrong. Wrong on its direct effect, letting slavery into Kansas and Nebraska, and wrong in its prospective principle, allowing it to spread to every other part of the wide world where men can be found inclined to take it. This declared difference, but as I must think, cover real zeal for the spread of slavery. I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Before proceeding, let me say I think I have no prejudice against the Southern people. They are just what we would be in their situation. If slavery did not now exist amongst us, we should not instantly give it up. This I believe of the masses North and South. Doubtless there are individuals on both sides who would not hold slaves under any circumstances, and others who would gladly introduce slavery anew if it were out of existence. We know that some Southern men do free their slaves, go north, and become tip-top abolitionists, while some Northern ones go south and become most cruel slave masters. When Southern people tell us they are no more responsible for the origin of slavery than we, I acknowledge the fact. When it is said that the institution exists and that it's very difficult to get rid of in any satisfactory way, I can understand and appreciate the same. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not know how to do myself. If all earthly power were given to me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that whatever of high hope, as I think there may be in this, in the long run, its sudden execution is impossible. If they were all landed there in a day, they would all perish in the next 10 days. And there are not surplus shipping and surplus money enough in the world to carry them there in many times 10 days. What then? Free them all? Keep them among us as underlings? It's quite certain that this betters their condition. I think I would not hold one in slavery at any rate, yet the point is not clear enough to me to denounce people upon. What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feeling accords with justice and sound judgment is not the sole question, if indeed it is any part of it. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot safely be disregarded. We cannot, then, make them equals. It does seem to me that systems of gradual emancipation might be adopted, but for their tardiness in this, I will not undertake to judge our brethren of the South. when they remind us of their constitutional rights, I acknowledge them, not grudgingly, but fully and fairly. And I would give them any legislation for the reclaiming of their fugitives, which should not, in its stringency, be more likely to carry a free man into slavery than our ordinary criminal laws are to hand an innocent one. But all this, to my judgment, furnishes no more excuse for permitting slavery to go into our own free territory than it would for reviving the African slave trade by law, the law which forbids the bringing of slaves from Africa, and that which has so long forbid the taking them to Nebraska can hardly be distinguished on any moral principle. And the repeal of the former could find quite as plausible excuses as to the latter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to read at any greater length, but this is the true complexion of all I have ever said in regard to the institution of slavery and the black race. This is the whole of it, and anything that argues me into his idea of a perfect social and political equality with the Negro is but a specious and fantastic arrangement of words, by which a man can prove a horse chestnut to be a chestnut horse. I will say here, while upon this subject, that I have no purpose directly, indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and the black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having a superior position. I have never said anything to contrary, but I hold that notwithstanding all this, there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I agree with Judge Douglas. He is not my equal in many respects, certainly not in color, perhaps not in moral or intellectual endowment, but in the right to eat bread without leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns. He is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man. Now I pass on to consider one or two more of these little follies. The judge is woefully at fault about his early friend Lincoln being a grocery keeper. I don't know as it would be a great sin if I had been, but he is mistaken. Lincoln never kept a grocery anywhere in the world. It is true that Lincoln did work the latter part of one winter in a small still house up at the head of a hollow. And so I think my friend the judge is equally at fault when he charges me at the time when I was in Congress of having opposed our soldiers who were fighting in the Mexican War. The judge did not make his charge very distinctly, but I can tell you what he can prove by referring to the record. You remember, I was an old Whig, and whenever the Democratic Party tried to get me to vote that the war had been righteously begun by the president, I would not do it. But whoever they asked for any money or land warrants or anything to pay the soldiers there during all that time, I gave the same votes that Judge Douglas did. You can think as you please as to whether that was consistent. Such is the truth, and the judge has the right to make all he can of it. But when he, by a general charge, conveys the idea that I withheld supplies from the soldiers who were fighting in the Mexican War, or did anything else to hinder the soldiers, he is, to say the least, grossly and altogether mistaken, as the consultation of the records will prove to him. As I have not used up so much of my time as I had supposed, I will dwell a little longer upon one or two of these minor topics upon which the judge has spoken. He has read from my speech in Springfield, in which I say that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Does the judge say it can stand? I don't know whether he does or not. The judge does not seem to be attending to me just now. But I would like to know if it is his opinion that a house divided against itself can stand. If he does, then there is a question of veracity, not between him and me, but between the judge and authority of a somewhat higher character. Now, my friends, I ask your attention to this matter for the purpose of saying something seriously. When he undertakes to say that because I think this nation, so far as the question of slavery is concerned, will all become one thing or all the other, I am in favor of bringing about a dead uniformity in the various states in all their institutions, he argues erroneously. The great variety of the local institutions in the states, springing from differences in the soil, differences in the face of the country and the climate, are the bonds of union. They do not make a house divided against itself, but they make a house united. If they produce in one section of the country what is called for by the wants of another section, and this other section can supply the wants of the first, they are not matters of discord, but matters of union. But can this question of slavery be considered among these varieties in the institutions of the country? I leave it to you to say whether, in the history of our government, this institution of slavery has not always failed to be a bond of union, on the contrary, been an apple of discord and an element of division in the house. I ask you to consider whether, so long as the moral constitution of men's minds shall continue to be the same, after this generation and assemblage shall sink into the grave, and another race shall rise with the same moral and intellectual development we have, whether, if that institution is standing in the same irritating position in which it is now, will it continue to be an element of this division? If so, then I have a right to say that in regard to this question, the Union is a house divided against itself. And when the judge reminds me that I have often said to him that the institution of slavery has existed for 80 years in some states, and yet it does not exist in some others, I agree to the fact, and I account for it by looking at the position in which our fathers originally placed it, restricting it from new territories where it had not gone, and legislating to cut off its source by the abrogation of the slave trade, thus putting the seal of legislation against its spread. The public mind did rest in the belief that it was in the course of ultimate extinction. But lately, I think, and in this charge, I charge nothing on the judge's motives. Lately, I think that he and those acting with him have placed that institution on a new basis, which looks to the perpetuity and nationalization of slavery. And while it is placed upon this new basis, I say, and I have said, that I believe we shall not have peace upon the question until the opponents of slavery arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction. Or, on the other hand, that its advocates will push it forward until it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Now, I believe if we could arrest the spread and place it where Washington and Jefferson and Madison placed it, it would be in the course of this ultimate extinction, and the public mind would, as for 80 years past, believe that it was in the course of ultimate extinction. The crisis would be past, and the institution might be let alone for 100 years, if it should live so long, in the states where it exists. Yet it would be going out of existence in the way best for both the black and white races. My friends, that ends the chapter. Move ahead to the Freeport debates. Good Kentucky tea, Judge. I know you favor strong libation.
We will have some concluding remarks. I'll say something and we have Q&A.
Still, one more debate to go. And theirs as well. Ladies and gentlemen, on Saturday last, Judge Douglas and myself first met in public discussion. In my speech of an hour and a half, I attended to some other parts of his speech and incidentally, as I thought, answered one of the interrogatories then. I then distinctly intimated to him that I would answer the rest of his interrogatories on condition only that he should agree to answer as many for me. He made no intimation at the time of the proposition, nor did he in his reply allude at all to the suggestion of mine. I do him no injustice in saying that he occupied at least half of his reply in dealing with me, as if I had refused to answer his interrogatories upon condition that he will answer questions from me not exceeding the same number. I give him an opportunity to respond. As to the first one, in regard to the fugitive slave law, I have never hesitated to say, and I do not now hesitate to say, that I think under the Constitution of the United States, the people of the southern states are entitled to a congressional fugitive slave law. Having said that, I have had nothing to say in regard to the existing fugitive slave law, further than I think it should have been framed so as to be free from some of the objections that pertain to it currently without lessening its efficiency. And inasmuch as we are not now in an agitation in regard to an alteration or modification of that law, I would not be the man to introduce it as a new subject of agitation upon the general questions of slavery. In regard to the other questions, whether I am pledged to admission of any more slave states into the Union, I state to you very frankly that I would be exceedingly sorry ever to be put in a position of having to pass upon that question. I should be exceedingly glad to know that there would never be another slave state admitted into this Union. But I must add that if slavery shall be kept out of the territories during the territorial existence of any one given territory, and then the people shall have a fair chance and a clear field when they come to adopt the Constitution, do such an extraordinary thing as to adopt the slave Constitution, uninfluenced by the actual presence of the institution among them, I see no alternative, if we own the country, but to admit them into the Union. The fourth one is in regard to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. In relation to that, I have my mind very distinctly made up. I should be exceedingly glad to see slavery abolished in the District of Columbia. I believe that Congress possesses the constitutional power to abolish it. Yet, as a member of Congress, I should not, with my present views, be in favor of endeavoring to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, unless it would be upon these conditions. First, that the abolition should be gradual. Second, that it should be on a vote of the majority of the qualified voters in the district. And third, that compensation should be made to unwilling owners. With these three conditions, I confess I would be exceedingly glad to see Congress abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. And in the language of Henry Clay, sweep from our capital that foul blot upon our nation. In regard to the fifth interrogatory, I must say here, that is to the question of the abolition of the slave trade between the different states, I can truly answer, as I have, that I am pledged to nothing about it. It is a subject to which I have not given that mature consideration that would make me feel authorized to state a position, so as to hold myself entirely bound by a position. In other words, that question has ever been prominently enough before me to induce me to investigate whether we really have the constitutional power to do it. I could investigate it if I had sufficient time to bring myself to a conclusion upon that subject, but I have not done so. And I say so frankly to you here and to Judge Douglas. I must say, however, that if I should be of opinion that Congress does possess the constitutional power to abolish the slave trade among the different states, I should still not be in favor of the exercise of that power unless upon some conservative principles as I concede, asking to what I have said in relation to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. My answer as to whether I desire that slavery should be prohibited in all the territories of the United States is full and explicit within itself and cannot be made clear by any comments of mine. So I suppose in regard to the question whether I am opposed to the acquisition of any more territory unless slavery is first prohibited therein, my answer is such that I could add nothing by way of illustration or making myself better understood than the answer which I have placed in writing. Now in all this, the judge has me, and he has me on record. I suppose he has flattered himself that I was really entertaining one set of opinions for one place and another set for another place. That I was afraid to say at one place what I uttered at another. What I'm saying here, I suppose, I say to a vast audience, as strongly tending to abolitionism as any audience in the state of Illinois. And I believe I am saying that which, if it would be offensive to any persons and render them enemies to myself, would be offensive to persons in this audience. I now proceed to propound to the judge the interrogatories so far as I have framed them. I will bring forward a new installment when I get them ready. I will bring them forward now, only reaching the number 4. The first one is, that the people of Kansas shall, by means entirely unobjectionable in all other respects, adopt a state constitution and ask admission into the Union under it before they have a requisite number of inhabitants, according to the English bill, some 93,000. Will you vote to admit them? Question 2. Can the people of a United States territory in a lawful way, against the wishes of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? Question 3. If the Supreme Court of the United States shall decide that states cannot exclude slavery from their limits, are you in favor of acquiescing in, adopting and following such decision as rule of political action? Question 4. Are you in favor of acquiring additional territory in disregard of how such acquisition may affect the nation on the slavery question? I allude to this extraordinary matter in this canvass for some further purpose than anything yet advanced. Judge Douglas did not make his statement upon that occasion as matters that he believed to be true, but he stated them roundly as being true, in such form as to pledge his veracity for their truth. When the whole matter turns out as it does, and when we consider who Judge Douglas is, that he is a distinguished senator of the United States, that he has served nearly 12 years as such, that his character is not at all limited as an ordinary senator of the United States, but that his name has become of worldwide renown. It is most extraordinary that he should so far forget all the suggestions of justice to an adversary or of prudence to himself as to venture upon the assertion of that which the slightest investigation would have shown him to be wholly false. I can only account for his having done so upon the supposition that that evil genius which has attended him through his life, giving to him an apparent astonishing prosperity, such as to lead very many good men to doubt there being any advantage in virtue over vice. I can only account for it on the supposition that that evil genius has at last made up its mind to forsake him. And I may add that another extraordinary feature of the judge's conduct in this canvass, made more extraordinary by this incident, is that he is in the habit, in almost all the speeches he makes, of charging falsehood upon his adversaries, myself and others. I now ask whether he is able to find in anything that Judge Trumbull, for instance, has said, or in anything that I have said, a justification at all compared with what we have in this instance for that sort of vulgarity. I have been in the habit of charging as a matter of belief on my own part that in the introduction of the Nebraska bill into Congress, there was a conspiracy to make slavery perpetual and national. I have arranged from time to time the evidence which establishes and proves the truth of this charge. I recurred to this charge at Ottawa. I shall not now have time to dwell upon it at very great length, but inasmuch as Judge Douglas, in his reply of half an hour, made some points upon me in relation to it, I propose noticing a few of them. The judge insists that in his first speech I made, in which I very distinctly made that charge, he thought for a good while that I was in fun, that I was lawful, that I was not sincere about it, and that he only grew angry and somewhat excited when he found that I insisted upon it as a matter of earnestness. He says he characterized it as a falsehood, as far as I was implicated his moral character in this transaction. Well, I did not know, till he presented that view, that I had implicated his moral character. He is very much in the habit, when he argues me up into a position I never thought of occupying, of very cozily saying he has no doubt Lincoln is conscientious in saying that. He should remember that I did not know, but he was altogether conscientious in that matter. I can't conceive it possible for men to conspire to do a good thing, and I really found nothing in Judge Douglas's course of argument that is contrary to or inconsistent with his belief of a conspiracy to nationalize the spread of slavery as a being a good and blessed thing. And so I hope he will understand that I do not at all question, but that in a matter he is entirely conscientious. I have called his attention to the fact that when he and some others began arguing that they were giving an increased degree of liberty to the people in the territories over and above what they formerly had on the question of slavery, the question was raised whether the law was enacted to give such unconditional liberty to the people and to test the sincerity of this mode of argument. Mr. Chase of Ohio introduced an amendment in which he made the law, if the amendment were to be adopted, expressly to declare that the people of the territory should have the power to exclude slavery if they saw fit. I have asked attention also to the fact that Judge Douglas and those who acted with him voted that amendment down, notwithstanding it expressed exactly the thing they said was the true intent and meaning of the law. I have called attention to the fact that in subsequent times, a decision of the Supreme Court has been made in which it has been declared that a territorial legislature has no constitutional right to exclude slavery. And I have argued and said that for men who did intend that the people of the territory should have the right to exclude slavery absolutely, unconditionally, the voting down of Chase's amendment is wholly inexplicable. It's a puzzle, a riddle. But I have said that with men who do not look forward to such a decision, or who had in their contemplation that such a decision of the Supreme Court would or might be made, the voting down of that amendment would be perfectly rational and intelligible. It would keep Congress from coming in collision with the decision when it was made. Anybody can conceive that if there was an intention or expectation that such a decision was to follow, it would not be a very desirable party attitude to go into for the Supreme Court. All or nearly all of its members belonging to the same party to decide one way when the party in Congress has decided the other way. Hence, it would be very rational for men expecting such a decision to keep the niche in that law clear for it. After pointing this out, I tell Judge Douglas that it looks to me as though here was the reason why Chase's amendment was voted down. I tell him that as he did and knows why he did it, it was done for a reason different from this. He knows what the reason was and can tell us what it is. I pass one or 2 points I have because my time will very soon expire. But I must be allowed to say that Judge Douglas recurs again, as he did upon 1 or 2 other occasions, to the enormity of Lincoln, an insignificant individual like Lincoln, upon his ipsa dixit or charge of proof, charging me to nationalize or have a conspiracy upon a large number of members of Congress, the Supreme Court, and 2 presidents to nationalize slavery. I want to say that, in the first place, I have made no charge of this sort upon my ipsa dixit. I have only arranged the evidence tending to prove it and presented it to the understanding of others, saying what I think it proves, but giving you the means of judging whether it proves it or not. This is precisely what I have done. I have not placed it upon my ipsa dixit at all. On this occasion, I wish to recall his attention to a piece of evidence which I brought forward at Ottawa on Saturday, showing that he had made substantially the same charge against substantially the same persons, excluding his dear self from that category. I asked him to give some attention to the evidence which I brought forward, that he himself had discovered a fatal blow being struck against the right of the people to exclude slavery from their limits, which fatal blow he assumed as an evidence in an article in the Washington Union published by authority. I asked, by whose authority? He discovers a similar or identical provision in the Lecompton Constitution. Made by whom? The framers of that Constitution? Advocated by whom? By all the members of the party in the nation who advocated the introduction of Kansas into the Union under the Lecompton Constitution. I have asked his attention to the evidence that he arrayed to prove that such a fatal blow was being struck, and to the facts which he brought forward in support of that charge, being identical with the one which he thinks so villainous in me. He pointed it not at a newspaper editor merely, but at the President and his cabinet and the members of Congress advocating the Lecompton Constitution and those framing that instrument. I must again be permitted to remind him that although my ipsa dixit may not be as great as his, yet it somewhat reduces the force of his calling my attention to the enormity of my making a charge against him. Go on, Judge Douglas.
Ladies and gentlemen, the silence with which you have listened to Mr. Lincoln during this hour is creditable to any large mass of people assembled for the purpose of hearing a political discussion. That kind of respectful attention that is yielded not only to your political friends, but to those who are opposed to you in politics. I am glad, that I have brought Mr. Lincoln to the conclusion that he had better define his position on certain political topics, which I called to his attention at Ottawa. He then showed no disposition, no inclination to answer. I did not present to him mere idle questions for him to answer for my gratification. I proposed to lay the foundation for these interrogatories by showing that they constituted the platform of the party whose nominee he is for the Senate. First, he desires to know whether, if the people of Kansas shall form a constitution by means entirely proper and unobjectionable, and ask for admission as a state before they have the requisite population for a member of Congress, whether I will vote for admission. Well, Even I regret exceedingly that when he put that interrogatory to me that he did not first answer it himself, instead of leaving us to infer which side he was on. Gentlemen, Mr. Trumbull, during the last session of Congress, voted from beginning to end against the admission of Oregon into the Union, although a free state, because she had not the requisite population. Mr. Trumbull is in the field fighting for Mr. Lincoln. I would like to have Mr. Lincoln answer his own question and tell me whether he is fighting Trumbull on that issue or not. But I will answer his question. In my opinion, whether Kansas has enough people to constitute a slave state, she has enough for a free state. I will not make any exception of Kansas to the other states of this union. I hold it to be a sound rule of universal principle to require territories to contain the requisite population for a member of Congress before they came into the Union. I made that proposition in the Senate in 1856. I renewed it in the Senate during the last session by a bill providing that no territory of the United States should form a constitution and apply to the Union until it had requisite population. Congress did not adopt my general rule requiring that all the territories to have that amount of population before they should come into the Union, but did make an exception of Kansas and applied the rule to Kansas alone. I will not stand by that exception. Either Kansas must come in the same as any other state with whatever population she may have, or the rule must be applied to all other states alike. I therefore answer at once, it having been decided that Kansas has enough for a slave state, has enough for a free state. I hope Mr. Lincoln is satisfied with that answer. The next question Mr. Lincoln propounded to me is, can the people of a territory exclude slavery from their limits by any fair means before it comes into the Union as a state? I answer emphatically, as Mr. Lincoln has heard me answer 100 times on every stump in Illinois, that in my opinion the people of a territory can by lawful means exclude slavery before it comes in as a state. Mr. Lincoln knew that I had given that answer over and over again. He heard me argue the Nebraska bill on that principle all over the state in 1854, 1855, 1856, and he has now no excuse to pretend to have any doubt on that subject. Whatever the Supreme Court may hereafter decide as to the abstract question of whether slavery may go in under the Constitution or not, the people of a territory have the lawful means to admit it or exclude it as they please, for the reason that slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless supported by local police regulations, furnishing remedies and means of enforcing the right to hold slaves. Those local and police regulations can only be furnished by the local legislature. If the people of the territory are opposed to slavery, they will elect members to the legislature who will adopt friendly legislation. Those who are unfriendly to slavery will adopt legislation that's unfriendly to slavery. Hence, no matter what may be the decision of the Supreme Court on that abstract question, still the right of the people to make it a slave territory or a free territory is perfect and complete under the Nebraska bill. I hope Mr. Lincoln will deem my answer satisfactory. The third question Mr. Lincoln presents is this. If the Supreme Court of the United States shall decide that a state of the Union cannot exclude slavery from its own limits, will I submit to it? Now I am amused. I am amused that Mr. Lincoln would ask such a question, as a schoolboy would know. The object of that question is to cast an imputation on the Supreme Court. Mr. Lincoln knows there was never but one man in America claiming any degree of intelligence or decency who ever for a moment pretended to that doctrine. It is true that at the Washington Union, in an article published on the 17th of last December, it put forth that doctrine, and it was in reply to that article in the Union that I denounced the Washington Union in the Senate last year in a speech, which Mr. Lincoln now pretends was against the president. The Union had put forth the doctrine that slavery had a right to go into the free states, and that any provision in the Constitution or laws of the free states of the country was null and void. I denounced it. I denounced it on the Senate floor. I was the first man that ever did denounce it. Trumbull and William Seward from New York, and John F. Hale, and Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, and the Republican side of the Senate were silent. They left it to me to denounce it. What was the reply made to me on that occasion? Mr. Toombs of Georgia got up and undertook to read to me a lecture upon the ground that I had deemed it worthy of notice to even reply to such an article as that in the Union, and declared there was not a man, woman, or child south of the Potomac in any slave state who did not repudiate any such doctrine. Mr. Lincoln knows that a reply was made on that subject a year ago, and now he wants to put the question. Suppose the Supreme Court of the United States shall decide that the states can't exclude slavery from their limits. Would I sanction it? He might as well ask you. Suppose Mr. Lincoln should steal a horse. Would I sanction it? It would be as gentlemanly in me to ask him what, in the event of his stealing a horse, ought to be done. Ask for him to ask me such a question. He throws an imputation on the Supreme Court of the United States that they would violate the Constitution of this country. I tell him that such a proposition as that is not possible, but would be an act of moral treason, an act that no man on the bench could ever descend to. Why, Mr. Lincoln himself would never forget himself in partisan feelingness to be guilty of an act of that kind. The fourth question, are you in favor of acquiring more territory without regard to how it may affect the country on the slavery question? That question is very ingeniously and cunningly put. The Republican Party, in their creed, laid down the proposition that under no circumstances would we acquire any more territory unless slavery first be prohibited in the country. I asked Mr. Lincoln whether he is in favor of the proposition. Are you against any further acquisition of territory under any circumstances unless slavery is prohibited? That he didn't like to answer. I asked him if he stands up to that article in the platform, and he turns around, Yankee fashion, and without answering it himself asks me, are you opposed to admitting a slave territory? I answered him that whenever it becomes necessary for our growth and progress to acquire more territory, I am for it without reference to the question of slavery. And when we have got it, that we leave the people in the territory free to do as they please, either to make a slave territory or a free territory, just as they choose. It is idle to tell me and to tell you that we have enough territory now. Our fathers supposed that we had enough when we acquired the territory only to the Mississippi River. But in view of the growth and expansion of the country, we were satisfied that we needed more territory. And we acquired the Louisiana Territory, including the west bank of the Mississippi River, to the British possessions. Then we acquired Oregon, and then California, and New Mexico. We have enough now for the present, but this is a young nation and a growing nation. I tell you, to increase, to multiply, to expand is the law of this nation's existence. One cannot limit this great country by mere boundary lines, saying, thou must go and no further. one of you might as well say to your son, 12 years of age, you are big enough now. Mustn't grow any larger. And in order to prevent growth, put a hoop around him to keep his present size. What would be the result? Either that hoop must burst and be rent asunder, the child must die. So lived this great nation. Now, a word or two in regard to Mr. Lincoln's answers on this question of the fugitive slave law. He says he was not pledged to the repeal of the fugitive slave law. He was not pledged to it. Doesn't quite like it. Wouldn't introduce a law to repeal it. Thinks there ought to be a law. Didn't tell what it is and don't know what to do. That is the substance of his answer about the fugitive slave law. I put the question whether he endorsed that principle of entire abrogation and repeal. He answers no. Then he will not tell what he will introduce, if he will introduce anything. If anybody else does so, I ask how will he vote? And his answer comes to nothing at all. Why can't he speak out and say what he is for and what he will do? In regard to there being any more slave states, he is not pledged on that. He wouldn't like to put himself in a position where he would have to vote either way. I pray you now, don't put him in a position to embarrass us so much. But if he goes to the Senate, he may be put in that position. And I ask, which way will he vote? Will he vote for or against admission of a slave state? I will vote for just such a state as the people forming the Constitution may want. If they want slavery, they shall have it. If they want to prohibit slavery, they may do it. They may do one thing or the other as they please, and I will receive them under the Constitution. Why don't you Republican candidates talk out as plain as that when I answer a question? Right, when we put a question. I do not desire to deceive any man out of his vote. No man shall be deceived in my principles if I have the power to express myself in terms clear and distinct enough to convey my ideas and meaning. Mr. Lincoln made a speech at Springfield when nominated for the United States Senate, which covers all of these abolition principles. He then lays down a proposition so broad in its abolitionism as to cover the entire ground. He says they must all become one way or the other. Must all become free or become slave. Otherwise, the Union cannot exist. That being the case, in his opinion, if we have any more slave states, so that it would continue, if we have more slave states, so that it would continue to be divided, it would dissolve the Union. I want to know whether Mr. Lincoln will vote for another slave state, believing that the effect of it will be to dissolve the Union. He says the Union cannot exist divided, that the end will be to make them all free or all slave states. Hence, he is making them all free in order that the Union may make them all free in order that the Union may exist. Yet he will vote for another slave state, knowing that it would dissolve the Union if it did. I ask you, is this fair dealing? The true intent and inevitable conclusion from his Springfield speech is that he is opposed to the admission of any more slave states under any circumstances. If so, why does he not say so? Why does he not say so? If he believes that this country cannot exist divided into free and slave states, if he believes they must all become free in order to save the Union, he is bound as an honest man to vote against any more slave states. If he believes that, he is bound to do it. Show me that it is my duty under the Constitution, in order to save the Union, to do a particular act, and I will do it if the Constitution does not prohibit me. I am not for the dissolution of this Union under any circumstances. I will pursue no course of conduct to give just cause for the dissolution of the Union. I know Mr. Lincoln's object. He wants to avoid a distinct avowal of opinion in order to elect himself to the Senate.
Much as it pains me to admit this, Stephen Douglas won the 1858 Illinois Senate seat. Illinois, like a lot of the Great Lakes, Midwest states, whatever you'd like to call them, is divided into a distinctly northern and southern area. The Republican Party finished extremely strongly in the north, and a Democrat in the south, essentially splitting the vote in 1858. What helped Douglas is the fact that the Democratic Party, let's keep in mind there's in 1858 no direct election of senators. So the people, 15, 20,000 gathering at these debates, didn't actually get to cast votes. They actually would influence their senators and legislatures in their state house to vote for one of the candidates. Illinois, in 1858, the Democratic Party had a slight advantage in numbers, and that allows them, when they sit down and vote, to again send Judge Douglas to the Senate for another term. But it's interesting. It's one of the few highlights for the Democratic Party in 1858. They did not do well in other parts of the United States. This Republican Party that Lincoln, get help, whatever he says, put together in 1854, ran its first presidential election in 1856, win 11 of 16 free states, and say, hooray, we lost. But they had to get 2 more free states in 1860 to win it all. Lincoln's name is not on the ballot in the South in 1860. You can't vote for him, not like many people were going to, but in 1858, the other northern states began to go to the Republican Party. The question between 1856 and 1860 for the Republican Party, would they be a one-election phenomenon, or would they actually have national strength going into 1860? And it turns out, even though it did not end well for them in Illinois, in other states, in Pennsylvania in 1858, the home of the incumbent president, James Buchanan, goes to the Republican Party. Some of these other so-called battleground states go Republican. That is a preview of 1860. That means they have to hold on to the states in 1856 and get a few more, and they win the whole election. The North has more people than the South. They control the electoral votes. So Lincoln can win as a regional candidate in 1850 or 60 after he gets the nomination. But I'm here to talk about my friend Judge Douglas. His long-sought-after goal of winning the nomination for the Democratic Party for president happens in 1860. And one of the last national institutions falls apart. It's the Democratic Party. The South walks out after he's nominated because they do not want to vote for or support someone who would oppose the Kansas Constitution, was pro-slavery. Douglas stood up, broke with his president and his party, and said, if this Constitution will be the law of the land, I will resist it to the last. And then Lincoln put him in a corner at the Freeport debate. What is the natural state of the territories? He asked Lincoln, and Douglas said, as you heard, anti-slavery. If the people say nothing, slavery cannot exist. They must make protections for slavery for it to be the law. Goodbye, 1860 nomination. At that point on, for essentially Stephen Douglas. And the party split. In 1860, there are 4 candidates for president. Lincoln wins the nomination of the Republican Party. There is a Northern Democrat. The sitting Vice President John Breckinridge becomes a Southern Democratic nominee. And there is a Constitutional Union Party. Their platform is the Constitution, whatever that means. It's kind of a desperate point in 1860. When it becomes clear in 1860 during the campaign season that the Republican Party is strong enough in the North to win, Douglas shifts gears. One of the things that causes him to shift his strategy, his campaign handlers tell him, You're out of money. You can't campaign by the summer of 1860 anymore. Then, in the fall of 1860, the elections begin to come in the North. And it becomes very clear. He's campaigning in Iowa at some point, and he hears that more of the state legislatures and the governorships in 1860 in October have gone to Republican. His quote, it appears, Mr. Lincoln will be the next president. We must try to save the Union. I will go south. It is the heroic last chapter of Stephen Douglas's political career. He stops campaigning for president. He travels to the south, to hostile territory, and begins to convince his Southern friends that Abraham Lincoln, even though he never believed it in the debates, will not make war on slavery where it exists. You can take my word for it, Douglas said. Of course, the South doesn't believe it. And in 1860, when the vote comes in, Lincoln wins. Douglas then continues the time from the election to the inauguration to speak out against secession and to say at one point, you can only be on two sides in this question. There are patriots and there are traitors. So he's throwing down the gauntlet in 1860 and 1861. When Lincoln is sworn in March of 1861, there is an awkward moment before he gives his inaugural address, one of his first inaugural famous speeches. He has no place to place his hat or cane that he took with him. He takes them off. Sitting next to him is Stephen Douglas. It will give me great pleasure, sir. He puts them on his lap and he gives his inaugural address. Douglas then continues to campaign in the South. He faces attacks by the press, by Southerners, as a turncoat, because he had represented Douglas at some point the interests of the South, and now he had changed his political stripes. And he continues to campaign to keep the South in the Union until he succumbs to rheumatism, probably brought on by overwork throughout his political campaign, and the fact that, I made an offhanded joke before, Judge Douglas had probably a problem with drinking. Cirrhosis of the liver contributed to a lot of his early death. He was actually 4 years younger than Lincoln and dies in June of 1861 after his longtime friend Abraham Lincoln is sworn in to become the 16th president.
Thank you all for coming this evening. It's great to have had as good an audience as we can this evening. Well, after the Illinois State Legislature elected to send Stephen Douglas back to Washington, D.C. for another term in the United States Senate, Abraham Lincoln continued to act as a significant force in the new Republican Party and held fast to his belief that the institution of slavery was wrong. In 1860, Lincoln delivered an address at Cooper Union, New York, where he suggested that the framers of the Constitution not only disagreed with the idea of popular sovereignty, but that they also attempted to place restrictions on slavery. He pleaded that the Constitution must be upheld, that slavery's expansion must be limited, the fugitive slave law must be enforced. Historian James Oakes, in The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and the Triumph of Anti-Slavery Politics, writes that the Cooper Union speech was the most important speech of Lincoln's political life up to that point. It was 1860, presidential election year. Prominent Eastern Republicans stopped the audience to have a look at this potential candidate. Both his debates with Stephen Douglas and his Cooper Union speech, therefore, gave Lincoln and the Republican Party a national stage. In May of 1860, Lincoln was nominated by the Republicans as their presidential candidate, while party loyalists campaigned on his behalf on a platform which opposed the extension of slavery into the territories. The platform also called for a Homestead Act, federal aid to construct a transcontinental railroad, adjustment of the tariff to encourage industry, and a living wage for working men. In essence, free soil, free men, free labor. And in November of 1860, Lincoln was elected 16th President of the United States, and just a few weeks later, South Carolina seceded, followed by Mississippi and the other states of the Deep South. And by April 1861, a month after Lincoln had taken the oath of office, the country had spiraled downward into the abyss of civil war. And you pretty much know, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. Thank you.
This was a very present-minded lesson for us tonight. Today, the Congress is just as bitterly divided as it is now. But there's a big difference in Stephen, Douglas, and Abraham Lincoln. What you don't have time to go into, but James and I talked about this all along. People forget what close friends they remained. They were very close. In fact, they traveled together. They ate together. They rented a room together as lawyers.
They courted the same young lady.
And courted the same young lady.
I don't know who won that one, Judge Douglas. I know about Mary Todd Lincoln now.
Well, anyway, the thing of it is, when it came to what was best for the country, they came together as one. And it's a desperate thing that our Congress needs to take a lesson from today. They're too busy with their own ideology or labels to really get anything done in Congress. Yet in those days, with all that we were facing, these two men came together. They came together at the end and wanted what was best for America. It's a shame it's not the same thing with the Congress today. Now, we'll have a short Q&A.
First of all, I'm glad you guys don't decide to really enjoy that. I don't have a historical question. I have a contemporary question about why did you not run for this company?
Give a Sherman answer.
If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. I'm perfectly happy in my own post.
We're glad to have our visitor in the back there, and he's done a good job filming all of this. We appreciate everybody showing up. I'm sorry that the St. Mary students had to leave early, but remember they're high school students and they have to leave at a certain time. But I noticed they paid very much attention to their professor when he got up and said this. They all filed out there.
Not a moment of brain freeze.
Not